What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. So we've been talking about high frequency radio for emergency preparedness. Today I want to talk a little bit about power supplies. All right, so in a minute I'll show you some video of my power supplies that use AC that I have plugged in inside. But we're going to talk a little bit about batteries today, a little bit about solar today. You'll see I've got two things here. I've got this Bioenno foldable, I think this is 28 watts if I remember correctly, plugged into this 6 amp hour lithium iron phosphate battery. Hard to see, but you'll see a green light flashing right there. It was there because you see little flashes. All right, so it's on standby right now, which means that battery's now fully charged. This guy over here is just an EcoFlow little solar generator. You can see that it's currently, I don't know if you can see the screen or not, but it's at 100% right now. All right, you can see it's powered on. This is the solar panel that comes with that. All right, this will do, I think it's 22 volts. And then this has got a charge controller inside. It'll also do, there's a USB right here. All right, so you can charge things directly, USB-C on there. On the Bioenno, I've got this Genasun charge controller on it. This guy can also, you'll see the red light is on, which means we're charging. This also has a USB on it. It's not a Type-C, it's an A. All right, but you can charge 12 volt, you can run 12 volt from it. You can run USB from it, but if you're gonna charge 12 volt batteries, you're gonna need a solar charge controller because it's gonna put out more voltage than that battery can handle. So let's talk a little bit about some of the things that you need to consider when we look at powering an HF radio. All right, so I'm gonna actually turn the camera here a little bit. I'm on a little tripod that I've got to spin around here so I can get the angle correct. I apologize if the camera's moving around. I apologize for the loud car. I'll set you guys down for just a second here. And let me grab. There we go. Let me grab my sheet and my notes. So we're going to be talking about some things today. We're going to be talking about current draw, all right, and how to conserve battery power. We're going to talk about modes and duty cycles, power requirement calculators. That'll probably be the last thing we do. I'll go into the computer to do that. Different battery chemistries and things like that. Different connectors, and then voltages, things you might want to consider with voltage. So I'm gonna kind of jump around on this. I'm not going to follow it directly in order they are on the sheet here. I apologize if the camera's moving around. I'm trying to get the tripod folded up so I can hold this camera. So let's start with just by talking about the batteries themselves. So you've got a couple of different types of battery chemistry that you can be concerned with. You got your old sealed lead acid batteries, things like automotive batteries. You can use those in a pinch, but they're not great for this kind of stuff. Most of the batteries you use for these kinds of radios are going to fall into two camps: lithium iron phosphate and lithium ion. Okay, so they do the same thing, but they go about it a little bit differently. The battery chemistry is a little bit different. The way they discharge power is a little bit different. And I'm not going to get into all the physics behind all that stuff today. Just understand that lithium ion batteries can deliver more power quickly. A lithium iron phosphate battery isn't going to be able to develop quite as much power as quickly, but you can cycle them much deeper. In other words, I can draw them basically down to no voltage and charge them back up completely again. And the battery chemistry is much, much safer. Okay, so I've got a bunch of different things in front of me here. We'll start with some of kind of the most common stuff you're going to see. So what I've got here, this is a 25 amp hour, I'm sorry, 20 amp hour lithium iron phosphate battery. It's a 12 volt battery. It's nominally like 13.8 volts when it's all charged up. Okay, these lithium iron phosphate batteries are very safe. You don't run into the fire issues you do with lithium ion batteries. And there's always a risk, but not as much. So we'll talk about battery capacity. Just understand, the bigger that number, the amp hour rating, the bigger that number, basically the more current you can draw from this over an extended period of time, and it will deliver more current. Okay, if you don't understand what current is, think of it in terms of water. So current is like the actual water flowing. It's the actual electrons coming out of this battery. Voltage is the electromotive force or pressure. It's what's pushing the electrons out of the battery. Okay, so when we talk about 12 volts, that's the amount of pressure or force pushing the electrons out of the battery. That 20 amp hours is the capacity of the battery. Okay, and just to give you an idea of what 1 amp is 6.28 billion electrons passing 1 point in 1 second. So we're talking astronomical numbers of things, okay? So this is a 20 amp hour battery, 12 volts, lithium iron phosphate. Okay, this is the battery that I generally power my Yaesu FT891 with. I also power my FTDX10 with it when I'm out in the field. Okay, this battery has plenty of capacity to power those big 100-watt radios for what I'm using them for in the field. Okay, now this may or may not be enough for you depending on what you're doing. For most people, this is probably plenty of battery. I also have, let me get rid of this. This is a 12 amp hour lithium iron phosphate battery. So you can see this one's a little different. It's much smaller. Okay, you can see this guy's got screw terminals and I've got ring terminals on the cable. Okay, this guy's just got spade connectors. All right, those spade connectors, all I do is just build little terminals like this. So you can see I've got Anderson power poles. We're going to talk in a second about connectors going to 2 spade terminals attached to the battery. All right, and that's how I connect everything up. So again, not as much capacity, same voltage, but not as much capacity, not as much. It can't deliver the same amount of current and over the same amount of time. Okay, this battery will power this radio, but not for a super long time. I use this with the G90 a lot. The G90. All right, so the Yaesu FT891 is a 100-watt radio. This is a 20-watt radio. I do have 2 20-watt radios out here we're going to talk about. And you'll see why I have the radios here in a minute. This guy's plenty to run that G90 for a long, long time. I have 2 of these 6 amp hour lithium iron phosphate batteries. So I've got this one right here, and I have the one over on the solar panel right now. These are the batteries I normally run with the G90, and I have 2 of them, all right? The reason I like to have 2 slightly smaller batteries is I can have one running the radio while the other one is charging. If I've only got 1 big battery, when that thing's depleted, I'm sunk. I'd rather have 2 6 amp hour batteries than 1 12 amp hour battery. Now, 2 12 amp hour batteries would be great too. Just keep in mind, it's going to take longer to charge those. You have to have special chargers to charge these. You can't just charge these on a regular battery charger. You have to have a charger designed for lithium iron phosphate batteries or lithium ion batteries, depending on what type of battery chemistry you're working with. Okay, so understand that you can't just charge these off of any old battery charger. In fact, that is a Talent Cell brand 6 amp hour right there. That came with an AC wall charger that I used to charge all these with. Okay, you can buy those on Amazon. I'll see if I can get a link in the description for that. But the last lithium iron phosphate battery I've got here is this Bioenno. I have 2 of these also. These are 3 amp hour, and you can see how little this guy is. Right, it's tiny. Right, this is a Bioenno 3 amp hour, 12 volt lithium iron phosphate. This has the connectors. It's got 2 styles. It's got Anderson power poles. Okay, so if you're not familiar with Anderson power poles, this is the connector that you're going to see on most amateur radio stuff. All right, so you can buy these and build them yourself. You can build your own pigtails easily. All right, this is the battery I normally run things like if I'm going to run this 705 on an external battery or my TX500 in this kit. If I'm going to run that on an external battery, I'll use these guys. From there, I've got a bunch of other smaller batteries. So these are the batteries that I've run most of my radios on, but not everything. Okay, so let me get rid of some of these here. We'll talk about some of these smaller things back here. Now, these are not the kind of things you're going to run most of these radios on, but I do want to talk about them. So this is a little Talent Cell. All right, this is a 12 volt, 3 amp max Talent Cell. All right. It's got a 12 volt jack. You turn it on and it powers the radio up. I can run all these little QRP or low power radios on this. I've done it plenty of times. Not enough to run any of these bigger radios though. I wouldn't even attempt. Okay. This is a little AA holder, and inside there are, I think 4, if I remember correctly, lithium iron phosphate AA rechargeable batteries. Okay. I can run some of my real small, like Morse code only radios on this guy. This is a little lithium ion. This is actually like a drone pack, all right? These you gotta be careful with because these will start fires, okay? But this little tiny battery, I can run, for instance, some of my mountain toppers, my little CW only QRP radios. I can run that thing for a long, long time in this little tiny battery. Again, you got to be a little careful with them because they can't start fires. All right, this is a USB rechargeable. It's a jet pretty low, and it's pretty loud. I wonder what that is. It sounds like a military jet. Oh, wait, what? Nope. It's coming right over us, though, whatever it is. Let's see what it is. Well, that's not a jet. That's a prop plane. Cool beans. Must be landing at the airport right down the hill from me. Anyway, we're back. Sorry about that. ADHD kicking in. So this is a little 9-volt rechargeable. Okay, I can run my little tiny CW only radios on this as well, and I can do it for, I can run those for quite a while on one of these little 9-volt batteries. Now, I can't run any of these bigger radios on it, but some of my little tiny Morse code only radios, I can, no problem. In here, I'm actually going to set you guys down for a second because it'll be easier to unzip this, and then I'm going to need to have this, I need to have both hands free to do some of these things anyway, so let me set you guys up on the tailgate here. Sorry about the view of the sky. Okay, so inside here, I have a little USB PD power bank. Okay, so this can charge and discharge just regular USB 5 volts. It can also do USB power delivery. So in here I have a 12-volt trigger cable. So this cable plugs into USB-C on this side. It's got a 12-volt barrel jack on this side, and I can power my 12-volt radios off of this USB PD power bank. Okay, so any of my smaller QRP radios, my low power radios, I can run those off just that little USB power bank using a trigger cable. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. When I pack power banks, like to charge my phone and stuff, I generally carry PD ones. That way I can power my radios off them as well. Okay, so it kills two birds with one stone. Now some of these radios, so for instance, this IC705 right here, all right, this guy can be powered externally through a 12-volt adapter, or it takes ICOM handheld radio HT batteries. All right, so you can, if I can get that guy off there, there it goes. All right, it just takes regular like handheld walkie-talkie type batteries. They plug in. There are two different versions. This is the larger version. It's a higher capacity. Okay, and I can plug those in interchangeably. I can power that radio for quite a while on just these little lithium-ion 7.4 volt HT batteries. Okay, some of these radios, so like this KX2 here, I'm going to take this apart in front of you so you can see this and get everything in frame here. So here's our KX2, and if I take the back off the KX2, inside you will see a 10.8 volt, 2600 milliamp hour lithium-ion battery. Okay, so this has an internal battery. Now, I can take that out and charge it. The newer ones of these have internal chargers. I can install one in this, I just haven't done it yet. All right, I can also plug this guy into external power as well. So we've got a 12-volt jack, sorry about that, right there as well. Okay, so that guy can be powered off 12 volts also. So what I'll do with a lot of these radios is I will run them on an external power source. You know, I'll plug them in on, let's say, oh, I don't know, this 3 amp hour Bioenno. All right, and then you'll see I've got, so like here's a cable that I've got built that runs, if I need to run any of these batteries to, right, power poles, I can do that. So if I need a male jack, like I would to go to those radios, I can plug that guy in and then plug it into the radios. Okay, well usually what I'll do is I'll run those radios on an external battery and conserve the one inside, and then if I need to switch to the internal battery, I will. Understand, like this 705 is 5 watts in the internal battery, 10 watts on an external battery. So that's something to consider also, is, you know, what kind of power output are you going to get? Now, power output's not always super crucial. People make a big deal out of it, but it doesn't necessarily need to be. Now, I do have a couple other radios out here. The only reason I have the FX4CR out here, I'm going to pull that out of its pack real quick, and I want to show you why I have that here. My camera's tilted a little bit. Sorry about that. Okay, so let me bring this up. Go ahead and take this guy. Oh, gotta love these cheap plastic cases. This is the case this thing came in. The case is pretty cheap. The radio is not, but the case is. So this radio uses this style connector. It's sort of like a RC connector. Now the reason I have this out here is the connector on the back of this EcoFlow solar power bank is the same connector. So I can charge this using 12 volts like on a cigarette lighter adapter. All right, I plug it in where this is currently plugged in now, and then you plug it into, let's say, the cigarette light adapter on your vehicle. But the cool thing is I can take that same cable. So here's the cable. So you can see it's got a cigarette adapter there, and it's got the same adapter on the side here. I can plug this guy, I can take it directly off the solar generator, plug it into the side of the radio, and then I can plug this guy into the 12 volt jack on the front of this battery right here. And it will run this radio forever. This thing will run that radio for, I mean, an insane amount of time, okay? So if I'm going, let's say I'm going camping and I want to be able to run that radio for days, I'll bring this guy, keep it topped off, plug the radio into this, and it'll just run for eons, okay? So there's something to be said about things that are sort of, can work sort of compatible between devices. So the new FX4CRs come with, I think they come with a regular barrel jack on the side, so you would just have to build an adapter to go a 12 volt plug into that, but you wouldn't even necessarily need to. I mean, you could, there's other ports on the front of that thing you could plug into also, but that's probably what I would do, is I would just build a 12 volt like cigarette lighter adapter to a 12 volt barrel jack or whatever jack is on there now. All right, and that would get the job done also. It just happens to use the same adapter, and I was like, ooh, that's cool. So now I can run that radio directly off of that without any extra cables, which I think is kind of neat. So when we talk about current draw, understand these radios all have a different amount of current draw. Now, I'm not just talking about transmit current draw. In a little bit, we're going to go in the shack, and I'm going to get on the computer, and I'm going to show you how to calculate roughly how big a battery you're going to need for your radio. But to figure out transmit current draw is not really that hard. It's just Ohm's law. All right, if you know your battery voltage and you know what your power output is, you can do the math and calculate roughly what your current draw is going to be. The hard one is receive current draw. So when the radio is not transmitting, what's your current draw? Because that radio just sitting there is pulling current, right? It's running. This is something you really need to consider, especially in emergencies. Okay, so for instance, the ASU 891 will draw from anywhere between 1 and 2 amps just sitting there, depending on a number of factors. If you got the backlight on or not, how high the volume is, what your battery voltage is, all those kinds of things. Just sitting there, it'll draw over an amp. Okay, that's a lot. That's one of the issues with the 891, and it's not a bad thing necessarily because it's a great radio. Just understand that you're going to need more battery even just sitting there listening. Okay, so to give you an example of what some of these other radios are like, the KX2 on receive is about 135 milliamps. So like 1/10 of what that guy will do. So it'll last, you can receive for 10 times longer on the same battery using the Cellarcraft radio as you could that Yaesu. All right, the TX500, which is in this pack right here, is about 100 milliamps. That thing sips current. Okay, so again, 10 to 15 times longer than this guy. The FX4CR that I just showed you is about 220-ish milliamps. I forgot to look up what the 705 draws, but it's probably someplace in that range also. The G90 is about half an amp, about 500 milliamps. Okay, those are things you really, really need to consider when you look at buying a radio for emergency use. Not only how much power does it draw when you're transmitting, but how much power is it using just sitting there receiving signals? Because that's gonna play a big role in how fast you deplete these batteries, right? You know, if my radio draws one, so if I really want to listen for a long time, I'll plug that TX500 and I'll turn the backlight off on the display and just let that thing sit, and it'll go, oh, I can run one of those things for days on one of these little batteries. I can plug it in on this guy and literally run for days. What I used to do, in fact, in my shack, before I bought my big radios, I ran my G90 as my main radio, and I didn't even have a power supply. I just ran 2 of these 6 amp hour batteries, and every night I would take one off the radio, I'd plug it into the charger, I'd put the other battery on the radio and use that all day, okay? So that's something you really want to consider when you look at buying these radios, is how much current do they draw, not only on transmit, but on receive, okay? And then what kinds of things can you do to cut that power down, right? So can I turn the backlight off? Can I turn the display off completely? So like this 705's got a very nice color waterfall. if I turn it on, if you'll be able to see it in the sun here, you should be able to. Let's see, this has got this guy in it. All right, so it's got a very nice color display, but that draws a lot of current. I can just hit that button, put the screen to sleep. It will go to sleep by its own eventually also, all right? But, you know, if you can do things to pull that current draw down while the radio is just idling listening, that's good, okay? We talked about the battery types. Like I said, when we talk about connectors, most radios are going to fall into a couple camps. You're either going to power them with an Anderson power pole setup. Okay, so here's one without the cover on it so you can see what they look like. So either an Anderson power poles, or it's going to be a 12 volt kind of barrel jack like that. That's what most radios are going to fall into. There are obviously variables to that, right? Like I said, like that FX4CR uses a funky one. The G90 has its own proprietary, well, it's not proprietary, but its own different plug setup. Okay, the Yaesu radios, same way. Now you can get, I think the new ones of those actually come with Anderson power poles on the back, if I remember correctly. The Yaesus have a funky 4-pin connector. You can do a power pole conversion to these. I haven't bothered. I just use the stock cable and just run it directly to the battery. This is really the only only radios I run on that battery are the Yaesus, and they both use the same connector. But you could switch everything over to power poles. That's what most people do. Like I said, I think, don't quote me on that, but I think the new version of the G90, the one that has the vents in the bottom and everything, I think that has power poles from the factory, which is a good move on Shagu's part. Voltages, understand some of these radios are going to be pretty picky with voltage, both minimum and maximum, okay? Some of my little low power Morse code only radios, they don't like much more than 12 watts. Well, these are like 13.8 fully charged. And you can cook the internals in some of those radios if you pump too much current through them or put too much voltage through them, especially if your antenna isn't a great match, okay? Some of these radios have really, really robust internals. You know, you don't have to worry about it as much. That's something you need to consider, though. What are the voltage tolerances of that radio? Some radios are going to have a really narrow voltage tolerance. Some are going to be really wide. They might be 8 volts to 14 or 15 volts. Some might only be 9 to 12. So those are things you really, really need to think about. When you buy a radio and you're buying a power supply for it, make sure the power supply has enough capacity to run the radio for as long as you want to run it, and make sure that it's not going to be over or under voltage, okay? Mode and duty cycle. Before we go in and we look at power calculations, understand that different modes are going to pull different kinds of current and for different amounts of time, right? So, like digital, a lot of digital modes are going to draw a tremendous amount of power because the radio is transmitting at full power for maybe extended periods of time. Okay, if you're sending a WinLink email, it might be transmitting on and off at full power for several minutes. If you're doing something like, let's say, JS8 call, same kind of thing. It might be transmitting full power for 15 to 30 seconds at a time. Well, it's 15-second cycles, so it'll be 15 seconds on, 15 seconds off. All right, Morse code, when you're transmitting, it's 100% duty cycle. That is just on. AM and FM are going to draw pretty much the same kind of thing. They're like 100% duty cycle also. Single sideband isn't, so if you're doing voice single sideband, that's going to be a lower duty cycle. So it's going to draw less power. Just understand it's also less efficient, right? Voice in general is going to be less efficient than Morse code or digital is, but it's going to be the mode most people are going to use. So single sideband is going to be more efficient than FM or AM, all right? So those are some things to consider as well. So, you know, how much current is the radio going to draw, both on receive and transmit? What can you do to conserve your power? Can you turn your backlighting down, your screen down? Can you turn your transmit power down? A lot of times, you don't want to run any more power than is necessary to make the contact. So that's a 100-watt radio. But if I can make the contact on 5 watts, why would I want to put out 100 watts? It's wasting power, and it's just splattering my signal all over the place. Use the minimum amount of power necessary to make the contact. Okay, now if you need to crank the power up to get out, do it, but use as little as necessary. Like I said, pay attention to your modes. You know, what motor you're using, because that's going to play a role in how long that battery is going to last. How, you know, the duty cycle on those modes. You know, what type of battery are you running, right? Like I said, most of these radios I'm going to use lithium iron phosphate batteries for, except for it's lithium ion in this guy. These guys are lithium ion. Pretty much everything, this is lithium ion. Pretty much everything else is lithium iron phosphate. All right. Connectors, like I said, most people convert everything over to Anderson power poles. but you use what you want to use. I like to convert most of my stuff over to this, so everything's compatible with everything else, with a few notable exceptions. And then, like I said, pay attention to your voltage requirements. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pack all this stuff up. We're going to head inside. I'm going to hop on the computer, and we are going to take a look at how to calculate roughly how big a battery you need. Okay, I'll also show you quickly what the power supplies in the shack look like. I've got 2 of them in there that I use. So I'll show you those real quick, and then we'll hop into the computer and we'll take a look at some power requirement calculators. All right, folks? So I'll be back in just a minute. So I have 2 different power supplies here. This is probably not the kind of thing you'd be looking at for emergency use, but I mean, you could if you had actual power available. So the first one is my Samlex power supply that I actually use to power the FTDX10. All right, so we'll talk about, current draw and things like that, power requirements, but you got to make sure if you're buying a power supply that it has the ability to deliver the amount of power that your radio needs. I've also got this little Pro Audio Engineering. This is a QRP power supply. I actually use this with I can power the KX2 with it, the TX500 with it, the G90 with it. I usually power my IC705 with it. So there are those kinds of things that you can use also if you have normal AC power available to you. But in an emergency, the chances of you having AC power ready to go and available are low unless you have whole house solar or you've got a generator. So I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about normal power supplies because again, these are the kind of things you're going to be running most of the time when you're not on battery power. But in an emergency, I wouldn't want to have to rely on these things because they are reliant on having actual AC power available. Okay, so we're back. I actually recorded this once and then realized I punched some of the numbers in wrong, so I wanted to do it again because I didn't want to give you incorrect data. So we are on a battery life estimator on Forestate QRP's website, and so this is going to give us a rough estimation. This obviously isn't going to be perfect, all right. But this will give us a ballpark idea of how much battery we need to run a given radio for a given amount of time. So you'll notice here on top, it gives us some duty cycles. So you'll see single sideband is about a 20% duty cycle. CW, which is Morse code, is 40%. AM and FM is 100%. And digital is also going to be 100%. All right. Now, the first thing we need to know is our duration in hours. How long do we want to operate? So let's say it's 8 hours. Let's say we want to be able to operate that radio for 8 hours. And most of you are not going to be doing Morse code, so we're going to go single sideband. That's probably what most people are going to be using for this kind of thing. You might use digital. We'll plug some digital numbers in a minute as well. So our operator duty cycle is how long are we transmitting versus receiving? Now, because we're not just doing regular QSOs, we're having regular conversations. This is more for emergency communications. We're only going to be transmitting when we need to. Most of the time, we're probably going to be listening to what's going on. So let's make this 20%. In other words, we're talking 20% of the time, listening 80% of the time. Obviously, that's going to change depending on what's happening, but let's start with that number. So let's start with our 100-watt radio, our Yaesu FT891. Right, that's a radio that a lot of people consider for this kind of stuff, and I'm not saying you shouldn't, but I'm going to show you some of the pitfalls here. So that radio's received current is about 1 amp. Okay, so just sitting there at idle receiving, it could even be just on with no actual voices coming through. That radio is going to draw about 1 amp. Right, now that radio at 100% power, if I'm at 100 watts, the maximum current that radio is going to draw, according to Yaesu, is 23 amps. Now, it's probably not actually going to draw 23 amps. It's probably going to be a little lower than that, but let's just for worst case scenario's sake, say it was 23 amps. All right, so I normally run that on a 20 amp hour battery. All right, if we want to cycle that battery so it's at 50% depth of charge, in other words, it's drawn halfway down. And a lot of batteries you don't want to draw all the way down. It doesn't really hurt the lithium iron phosphate batteries, but like lead acid batteries and things like that, not good for. It's not good to run lithium ion batteries all the way down either. All right. Oh, we can't do that. So if I click that, it tells you we can only run that radio for 5.3 hours. All right, at 20% operator duty cycle on single sideband at 100 watts. That's the problem with a radio like that, okay, is that it's going to be a power hog. Now, we can change some of these things. So let's suppose we cycle that battery deeper. Let's suppose we draw an extra 10% out of that battery. But we're still not there, but it got us closer. We're at 6.4%. What if we turn the power down? So let's suppose we turn it down. So now we're drawing 15 amps. That's probably, I don't know, 75, 80%, probably 70, 75 watts. Oop, we're still not there. We're close, 7.7 hours. So let's go down to like, let's say we're at like 50 watts. That's probably about 10 amps. Oh, that'll get us there. So we turn the power down to 50 watts. We can run that radio for about 8.8 hours on that battery. Okay. Now, let me show you what happens if we plug one of my more efficient radios in. Let's run like the most efficient all-mode radio, that's a good radio that I have in, and that's the TX500. So the TX500 draws 100 milliamps, 1/10 of the current on receive. Maximum transmit is about 2.5 amps, give or take. Not 12.5, 2.5. All right. Now look what happened. We're on that same 20 amp hour battery for the same 8 hours, single sideband, 20% duty cycle, but we're only drawing 100 milliamps on receive and 2.5 amps on transmit. Same 20 amp hour battery, drawn to the same 60% depth of charge. I can run that radio for 61 hours on that single battery. Okay. This is what I'm talking about with efficiency, and that's at 100% power. That's running full power output on that radio, which is, it's supposed to be 10 watts, but I've seen higher than that. I've seen as high as 15 or 16, depending on the mode and the band, all right? Realistically, it's probably like 11 or 12, okay? So you can see how much of a difference an efficient radio makes. Even if let's take that same Yaesu, we're gonna go back to our 1 amp, but we'll turn this thing down to, let's say its minimum power, okay? So if we take that same Yaesu and we turn it down to 5 watts, we're only gonna get like 11 hours out of that same battery because it's drawing so much current just sitting there, okay? If I go to, let's say our KX2, that's about 135 milliamps, about the same 2.5 amps draw. All right, I can run that for about 52 hours on that 20 amp hour battery. If I went down to, let's suppose, one of those little 6 amp hour batteries like the one I had on the solar panel, I can run that for 15.7 hours at 100% power, okay, on single sideband. And the nice thing about this is if you've got 2 of those, one can be on the charger while the other one is running the radio, and then you swap them out, okay? So 2 of those 6 amp hour batteries, even on a radio like the TX500 or the KX2, I could run all day long on one battery while the other one's charging and then swap them out, okay? Let's take a look at, for instance, let's say the G90. So the G90 on receive draws about 0.5 amp, so 0.5, 500 milliamps. The radio's maximum draw, and if I remember correctly, is about 8 amps on that radio. And that's absolute max, so worst case scenario. All right, I can run for about 4.5 hours. All right, now, if we turn the power down, all right, we're about 5.5 hours on that, okay? So you can do it, but again, you're cutting it pretty close. And again, because remember, we're only running half our power, and we've only got 0.5 amp of receive. We're still only, on that 6 amp hour battery, we're still only able to run about 5.6 hours, okay? Now, if I go to the 12 amp hour battery on that thing, now we're at 11.3, we're good to go. So I could run 8 hours a day on that 12 amp hour battery at a 20% operator duty cycle on single sideband and have no problem at all. Now, what would happen if we wanted to run, let's say, digital? All right, so let's make our duty cycle 50%. So we're transmitting and receiving at 50% on digital. Okay, and that's at half power. So this is only at about 10 watts. That's still not going to do it. 3.2 hours. 3.2 hours. Even if we turn the power down to, let's say, 5 watts. Let's say that's like 2.2 amps roughly. That's still not going to get us there. That's only 5 hours. All right, so mode is going to play a big role in this. How long you're transmitting versus receiving is going to play a big role in this. And your, like I said, your radios both transmit and receive efficiency is going to play a huge role in this. So if you wanted to be able to run that radio for a full 12, say 24 hours, all right, and we wanted to do, yes, I know it's not good. We wanted to do, let's say, single sideband, and you wanted to talk for 20% of the, come on, 20% of the time. We wanted to run, let's say, full power on that G90. See if we do it on a 20 amp hour battery, pulling it down only halfway. Nope, even on a 20 amp hour, we're at 15, we're only at 15 hours. Okay. So we couldn't do that. But what if I went to, let's say I went to the TX 500 now. All right, the TX 500, same 20% operator duty cycle, same battery, same depth of charge. I can run for 61 hours. So this again is why it's so important. Okay, if we change our operator duty cycle, we want to do 50-50. So let's suppose we're listening half the time, talking half the time. I can still run that TX 500 for 35 hours on that single 20 amp hour battery. Okay, so when you go to buy a radio for emergency use, don't just think power, power, power. Think about what is my current draw like, okay? Even on receive, because that radio might just be sitting there listening for a lot of the time, and it's drawing current that whole time. So let's put my other 20 watt radio in there before we finish things up. Let's go ahead and we'll put in the FX4CR. That draws about 220 milliamps. That's about 4 amps full power. That'll get us to, at full power, that gets us to about 20 hours. We're pretty close, okay? If I cycled that battery a little deeper, let's see if we went to 70%. Gonna get us real close, probably. Oh, that's real close. That's close to 24 hours, okay? And again, it's a LifePo battery, so I can cycle it that deep and not really hurt it, as long as I still have enough voltage to be able to run the radio. But if we leave that, let's say our standard 50% depth of charge, let's see how long we can run that radio. We can run that radio for 16.7 hours, all right? So if we were on our standard, let's say we went back to our 8-hour on time, right? We're double that, even on the FX4CR at full power. Okay. So again, these are some of the things you really want to consider. It's different if you're doing this for hobby stuff, right? Then we only need to worry about, like when I go out and do parks on the air, all I care is, do I have enough power to get the activation done, right? I always bring a backup battery just in case, because 2 is 1 and 1 is none. But when you're looking at these things for emergency use, like this might save your life or pass in and out vital traffic, you need to make sure that you have enough power solution, enough power delivery to run that radio for the amount of time you need to operate it. Like I said, you're going to want more than one battery, right? So you can have one charging while the other one's operating, especially if you're relying on solar, because then you're dependent on the sun being out. So it has to be daytime and it can't be super cloudy, right? The more clouds roll in, or the more shade you've got, that's going to affect your cell, your photovoltaic cell efficiency, right? Your charge is going to take much, much longer. So maybe even 3 batteries. So like, let's suppose I went to a 6 amp hour battery on this radio. I can run for 5 hours. So if I had at a 50% depth of charge, so if I had 3 of those, I just cycle them in and out. One's in the charger, one's in the radio, one's sitting. And then you just rotate through, all right? And like I said, if we go to and we'll go back to our 20% duty cycle, where we're listening 20%, or listening 80%, talking 20%, that gets us to our 8 hours. So if you had 3 6 amp hour batteries, you could run that radio 24 hours a day, have one radio or one battery on the radio, one battery on the charger, one battery on standby, okay? So hopefully this gives you a little bit of direction as far as where you might want to go in terms of not only what battery solution you might want, but what radio you might want based on how much battery you need to supply. So when you go to buy a radio, consider what modes it'll run, how efficient it is, does it meet the criteria for what you need to do, is it cost effective, things like that, and then determine what its power requirements are going to be, and then do the math. And I would say plug in your worst case scenarios, right? So you're transmitting, a lot more than you might normally be, or, you might not be able to cycle that battery as deep, whatever. Plug in your worst case scenarios with your maximum amperages and see what you get for times, and then buy batteries that meet those needs. Like I said, just remember that the bigger the batteries, the longer it's going to take to charge. So if you buy a couple of really big batteries, just remember, you're going to, especially if you're using solar panels and your solar panels aren't that big, like that one I had out in the yard, that's only, I think that's a 28 watt panel, if I remember correctly. It takes a while to charge one of those little 6 amp hour batteries. So if you're trying to charge a 20 amp hour battery on that, it's going to take a long time. All right. You might want bigger panels or more smaller batteries. At any rate, hopefully that gives you some food for thought as far as power requirements for the radios and how you might want to power them. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave them in the comments, and I will do my best to answer them. I appreciate all the support I've gotten. I'll do another sort of wrap up video where I'll talk about what if I was going to pick out of my stock that I own, what would I probably use if I could only have one of these radios or maybe two of these radios, because realistically I'd probably want two, one for sort of a home base station setup and one for portable setup. But again, that's going to depend on your budget and your needs and things like that. For me, I'd probably want two. So like I said, I'll do a video wrapping those kinds of things up. I do have some other videos that'll be coming out in this series. I have some radios on the way we'll talk about. I'm going to do a couple of videos that pertain specifically to GMRS because I've had a lot of questions about GMRS. So we'll continue this series and we'll cover some more topics. But at any rate, everybody, I really do appreciate you watching. I really do appreciate all support. And until next time, as always, 7-3.